In this video, I'll show you how to create a classic 80s reverb sound within the Decades expansion library for Superior Drummer 3. We're in the default state within the Decades library right now. Let's go into the preset menu under the Schmitt menu, and we're going to select this Broadway 80s Reverb. Now it's going to bring up a leady kit, and if we go into the mixer, it's already created an 80s Reverb bus channel. Let's take a look at what's going on here. So we're doing a bus send on the top snare mic channel, and that is sending to a bus where we have a 1981 classic reverb effect loaded. So that's going to help to give us this classic 80s reverb sound that we'll manipulate in a few ways. Note that within the Decades library, we also have this built-in reverb channel. So both the 80s reverb with the 1981 classic reverb effect and this reverb channel from the Decades library are working together to create this reverb sound. Now what I want to do before we even get started in the mixer is change the kit. I want a big punchy kit. If you think 80s music, typically you think big drums. So let's go ahead and go to our drum kit part presets, and we're going to grab this 1980s rock infusion, which is going to be the Pearl kit. And let's take a listen to that. Great sounding kit, and again, notice that the mixer has not changed at this point. We've just changed the kit. Now, I do notice in the toms that there's a lot of bottom snare rattle. Especially in that first rack tom. So a great feature within Superior Drummer 3 is that we can easily fix that and contour that snare buzz any way we want. We don't want to get rid of it because we want to keep that realism of the snare rattle that's a part of the samples and the sound of this captured kit, but we can taper it off. And we're going to do that by selecting the snare bottom channel, going into the properties menu, and all we have to do is turn down the toms. In fact, if I use my velocity pad, Control-Alt or Control-Option, we'll pin it. This is the rack tom, and I'm going to solo my snare bottom mic. You can hear a lot of that snare rattle. So in the properties menu, I'm going to select all the toms, rack tom 1, shift click all the way down to floor tom 2, and then we'll bring everything down a few dB. Let's unsolo the snare mic, the bottom snare channel, take a listen. And that's really cleaned that up. In fact, if we want to customize this more, we could bring the rack tom down even a little bit more, so we could adjust each tom any way we want. Now let's go into the mixer. What I would like to do is get this 80s reverb send, or this 80s sound, on the snare drum, kick, and the toms. And we can accomplish this in a couple of ways. I could simply grab this bus send, which again is sending the top snare channel to another bus channel where we have our 1981 classic reverb, and I want to copy this bus send onto the channels I want, kick and toms. Alt or Option click will allow me to drag and copy, so I've moved that over to the kick drum, and we can do that for all the toms as well. And this also allows us to leave the bottom snare channel out if we don't want to send the bottom snare to this 1981 classic reverb. Now I'm going to undo that, Command Z. If we wanted to, another way would be to create additional bus channels, not bus sends, but just route the kick to a bus. We'll label it as such, the snare drum to a bus, and maybe we want to capture both the top and bottom mic. So again, I'm clicking on the output, sending it to a bus, and then grabbing all of the toms. We'll send that to a bus as well. Now I can actually move, I don't want to copy, I want to move my bus send all the way over to the snare drum, and then I'll copy to the rest of the bus channels. We're essentially accomplishing the same thing, except for the fact that this snare bottom mic is now included, but this allows us to just have 3 bus sends instead of several on the individual channels. We can use them just on the bus sends themselves. And within each, we can adjust the level of the send, which will adjust how much 1981 classic reverb is being used on each of these bus channels. So without making any other changes, let's take a listen. So you can hear now the toms and kick have a bit more of that sound. Already sounds great, but let's increase these sends, and then we could turn down the 80s reverb channel as we need. So again, I'm going to exaggerate this. We'll turn these up quite a bit. We'll get them relatively close. So leaving the 80s reverb channel right where it's at, so this level right here, we should have a much more exaggerated sound. So I love that almost gated sounding 80s reverb. You've heard this in a lot of different tracks. Love that on the toms. Now, if any of these are too much or too little, we can adjust accordingly. Maybe the snare we want to dial back a bit, so I'll bring that down just a few dB. I'm going to keep the kick and toms where they're at. So again, you can manipulate these sends any way you want. Now, the overall send I mentioned, we can adjust that to taste as well. So it's set at 0 right now, and we've exaggerated the bus sends. So the kick, snare, tom, routed bus channels, we're basically taking a copy of that and sending it to this 80s reverb, where we have this effect, which we can also manipulate as well. But for right now, let's just adjust the 80s reverb itself. So you can take those relative adjustments we made to the bus channels for the 80s reverb send and adjust the overall volume with this 80s reverb fader. As I mentioned before, we can manipulate the actual 1981 classic reverb itself to see what kind of variations we can come up with that way. So note that these three options, decay, pre-delay, and this filter, this high dial, really have an impact on the sound as well. So the decay is really how long that 80s reverb sound is. Pre-delay is a delay as to when the classic reverb actually happens. So you can make it sound a bit delayed, which will make it sound bigger for each hit. There's a delay before you hear the actual reverb. And then this is a filter. You can hear how that drastically impacts the sound. here we're bringing back in some dry signal. So it's the wet, completely reverb channel, and we have the dry signal, and we can mix those together as well. Now, before we're done, I mentioned this reverb channel. This is the built-in reverb channel for the Decades library. It's not an actual mixer effect like this 1981 classic reverb. Instead, it was created as a reverb channel available within the library itself. So it's going to have its own sound and character that you can leverage as well. So there, what I've done is I brought the 80s reverb down. So I brought the 80s reverb bus channel down, but I've turned up the reverb. The 1981 classic reverb has that gated reverb sound where you have that reverb and then almost a drastic cutoff, whereas this built-in reverb channel has a little bit more of a natural decay, so you can use the two together to get the best of both worlds. So that's how you can very easily get a classic 80s reverb sound within the Decades expansion library for Superior Drummer 3. And one last thought is this is just one of any kit combination you can use within the Decades expansion library. I chose this Pearl kit, or under the part presets menu, this 1980s rock infusion, simply because it's a great sounding kit reminiscent of the 80s and the rock fusion style, but you can use any kit available within this library. For example, if we go down to the 1970s Soul, we maintain all of our mix choices, and now we have a whole other kit. I'll undo that. We can even make individual selections. So for the snare drum, I'll grab another great sounding snare, this Tama Bell Brass. So a lot of great options here within the Decades expansion library for Superior Drummer 3 when creating that classic 80s reverb sound.